everyone. Welcome to Achieving Success with Olivia Akin. I'm your host, Olivia Akin. Each week, we will discuss the roadmap of achieving your personal and professional success. We give you real-life stories on growing personally and professionally to achieve your life and career goals with the help of some top-notch guests. Today, we are speaking with Tony Michaelides. Tony is a renowned former music industry executive with over 30 years of experience in radio and television promotions, working with some of the biggest names in music history, from launching U2's first televised performance outside of Ireland to collaborating with legends like David Bowie, The Police, Bob Marley, and more. Tony played a pivotal role in artist development and shaping the careers of international superstars. As the founder of TMP, one of the most respected independent promotion companies in the UK, he works closely with major record labels and helped establish the careers of numerous artists. Now residing in Florida, Tony has transitioned into an author, keynote speaker, and industry consultant, sharing invaluable lessons he learned from rock and roll. His latest ventures include his podcast, Moments That Rock, and his book series, Lessons Learned from Rock and Roll, where he offers insights from decades inside the music industry. You can find Tony by searching him on LinkedIn at Tony Michaelides, or going to his website, TonyMichaelides.com, or by emailing him at tm4534@gmail.com. Hello, Tony. It's fantastic having you on the show today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Olivia, unless you live to regret it, of course. I'll just add one thing to that. I need to update all that. It's I'm involved with a new project called Rock the World to Peace, which no doubt I can drift into in the conversation. Again, music related.
Well, we will definitely touch upon that.
Lovely.
Before we do, to start off the show, can you tell me what success means and looks like to Tony Michaelides?
Well, success to me is, I think, I tend to say nowadays, Olivia, as I get an old bloke around me, is that I don't think that the appreciation sets in until the roller coaster ends. You know, because I was in the music industry in like a very exciting time, without being the guy who turns around and says, "Let me tell you what it was like in my day," because a lot of things have changed. The reason I came here was the industry was kind of falling apart around me, and I hadn't done anything wrong. But when you've got a topic like achieving success, I feel perfectly qualified in knowing what it takes to be successful from the people around me. And that has like an effect on yourself, because you also have failure staring in the face. You know why bands fail and artists fail. And certainly I brought a lot of that in, because my first book was Insights from the Engine Room, Lessons Learned from Rock and Roll, which I have classic case studies, basically that involve, not just music, but involve corporate America and everything. In as much as a lot of the artists I work with, people who are running companies, males, females in the US, anywhere in fact, grew up on these bands. So I tend to find that they listen to them differently. So when I speak about them, you kind of got everybody's ears, So, and especially with a lot of the people, not a lot, some of the people I work with, like David Bowie, it's incredible because when you grow up as a fan, I ended up working with people whose records I bought as a kid. So I don't lose sight of the fact that that's a real privilege, So success to me was kind of, you achieve it, but you keep wanting to get better at it, if that makes sense,
Mm-hmm. And that being said, as you mentioned, you had a front row seat and often a backstage pass to some of the most iconic moments in music history and things we're still talking about today, and helping shape the careers of legendary artists. But looking back, if you could choose one moment that truly encapsulates what it meant to be in the engine room, as one might say, of the music industry, whether it was in an artist breakthrough, a behind the scenes challenge, or a lesson that changed your own perspective, what would that moment be and why?
Well, one of the things that I think will resonate with everybody will be U2's appearance at Live Aid in '85. So we're coming up to like the 40th anniversary of that, we had, there were 4 albums out by U2. I was working with Island Records, and they released a song called Pride. And it was the first one we'd really got any serious amount of airplay on. And Live Aid was like a huge event with some of the biggest artists in the world. U2 weren't one of those at the time, I hasten to add. But we're talking about an audience of 1.9 billion people. That's not a bad viewership. So everybody was allowed 20 minutes. It doesn't matter if you're Queen or anybody, everybody got 20 minutes. So U2 did a couple of numbers, and then they went into a song called Bad, which was on the Unforgettable Fire. It had just come out. And what happened was Bono, in his infinite wisdom, decided to do a walk around and took a few steps down from the stage, and then walked down where the band couldn't see him, though they're on stage like this going, where's our singer gone? You know, just playing along. And he goes down to the front of the stage, and he pulls a girl out for the crowd, and he starts to slow dance with her, you know, and everything. And the band is still playing along, and then all of a sudden the plug gets pulled. And we're all there watching, thinking, oh my God, what have you done? I mean, it was absolute crisis in as much as, you know, the band went off stage, they weren't talking to him, they hated him, they were close to sacking him. Paul McGuinness, the manager, you know, was furious because, like I said, we had a huge audience, a captive audience all over the world. And this was the one song that people resonated with, which was the perfect piece of promotion for us. Paul McGuinness went off to Paris to stay with a friend, again, furious. Bono went off in embarrassment to stay with a friend in the south of Ireland. The other guys went home. Paul, the manager, went out the following morning to buy a copy of La Parisienne, and on the front cover was how U2 and Freddie Mercury stole the show. That week, all four of U2's albums went into the charts, and the rest is history. And it's a classic lesson of mistake turning into an opportunity. And you talk about achieving success. That's about as good as it gets from a complete screw up.
Using that moment as an example, why do you think, and being a part of that, your perspective of why in that moment everyone looked at the obvious of like, okay, this was an utterly mistake, and going through those moments, emotions, but what do you think was the pivot where in reality it blew them up and like made them so much more recognizable that
Well,
people didn't take into consideration?
it was literally a caught in the moment thing for Bono and for the crowd, because everybody kind of saw this moment where he was embracing this girl, kind of, you know, and it was just an incredible sensation to be watching it for people and for the audience at Wembley Stadium, you know. And I think that kind of, you know, the kind of human element, as much as anything, resonates, because it's not just a band like rocking out on stage trying to attract attention. It was just he had no plans to do that. I even interviewed The Edge before that and asked him what songs they were going to do, and he said, well, "As you know, Terry, we'll probably make it up as we go along." Well, man, was he right about that one? But if there was one song out of the four they were going to do, they didn't do it. But the band didn't know, you know. Like I say, that's probably like a pivotal moment that I'll never forget. And it's so long ago. And like I say, you asked me, and it was an obvious one to remember.
For you, as you've had some of these pivotal moments in your career, how have you leveraged, and we'll use that example as kind of the leaning point here, but those moments where everyone could be frustrated because you think something was a mistake, but in reality, it's something you can leverage, lean on, change the trajectory. How have you used moments like that in your own career as well?
Well, the thing is, I suppose in a way, with something like that and watching it from a band that, you know, was still on the up, was still kind of, you know, developing as an artist. Um, I kind of, I mean, for instance, I emigrated to America 20 odd years ago, 20 plus years ago, because the music industry was falling apart around me and I hadn't done anything wrong. But I'd achieved a lot of success in my time full on in the music industry. But I had like, you know, 10 people working for me, six company cars, and the overhead that went with it. So I came to America to reinvent myself. I was courageous enough to do it. They all have words for it now, like entrepreneurial and innovative. I like to call it flying by the seat of my pants, because I've never woken up every day and had a clue what was going to happen in the day. And in a weird way, I love that, because I'm not kind, no disrespect, but I'm not a 9 to 5 person. I never was, I never would be. I was, you know, I applied for a job in the music industry when I was kind of, I'd gone to college. I went to a thing called further education in college. So I don't have like degrees and all these things around me, in as much. But I kind of I came from a generation of kind of made it up as we went along. Further education college was perfect for people like me who were done with school but not quite ready for work. Didn't mean that I was not ambitious. I went to college and I did a course in business studies, which I'm not ashamed to say is probably the least of my skills. I'm more of a creative, I like to kind of bleed off other people and take that into my world and turn it into, because I did a lot of kind of things that changed the industry. Like I was the first person to have a regional promotion company, because the music industry, like everywhere, it's New York, it's LA, it's London. It's not like in the middle of the country where I was operating a manager, but it was kind of like, if you want me, I'll do it my way. And I didn't want to, like, my wife was pregnant and we had a 3-year-old. And when I got asked to work with A&M and the Police, who were the biggest band in the world at the time, the guy says to me, "When are you moving to London?" And I said, "I'm not moving to London." He said, "You'll have to move to London." I said, "I don't have to do anything." And if you think of that, I was risking my entire career, in as much as, we had one child and another one on the way. And I was thinking, don't tell me what to do. And I said to him, which made a lot of sense to me. He said, because London is like on the bottom of the country. So I said, why would I travel 200 miles south to travel 400 miles north to do my job? Which made a lot of sense to me. So I kind of just opened up a regional promotion company, worked still for Island Records, and with A&M Records. So I had everything from the Police to Bob Marley to Grace Jones, Steve Winwood. U2 were only just signed, but that was part of the reason I kind of returned to Ireland, for the challenge and the opportunity to work with a band like that. I'd been to see them play third on the bill like a month before, and it prompted me to phone the record company, who'd laid 5 of us off when they had financial problems in 1980. So I even went back to embrace a company that already laid me off once. But I just knew in a weird way that I wanted to work with this band, and it was a huge challenge. But we talk about success and achieving success. Here's a band that would, I would get, I'd get them up at, God knows what hour, to take him into any interview that I could get, but not in major stations, in a tiny station that went out at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. They'd get in the van, they'd have the equipment in the back, the tour manager driving, 4 hours in the pouring rain, 4 in a room, 2 motel rooms if they were lucky, blood, sweat, and tears, grafters in every sense of the word. I mean, what I always quote to people, Olivia, is there was no social media then. Can you imagine Bono getting in a van and for a 4-hour drive, reaching out through social media, getting like 10 fans in Japan and waking up and he's got 200 fans. Oh, I met this guy, he's in a band, blah, blah, blah. They had none of that. They would come out and meet the people. They worked as hard as anybody I've ever worked with. And you see, the thing is, I'm involved with this Rock the World to Peace project now, and it involves emerging talent. And like I say to people, nobody understands this, because when you say U2, it's like talking about Coca-Cola. They're a global brand. People don't understand they were emerging talent when I worked with them. Took me a year to get them on the radio. Like I said to you, we took them into every little radio station. They worked and grafted to get to where they are today. And, that is an achievement in itself.
I want to talk about what you're doing now. But before we do that, I have to ask, because we're seeing this more and more in today's society with the mass layoffs and everything like that. What was it like for you going back to an organization that had already laid you off one time before? And like, what was your mindset like at that time? And how did you make sure that potentially, I don't know, your own feelings of like what had occurred the first time and how hard you worked and everything like that didn't affect you doing your job?
Well, I started in sales in '74, selling folk and jazz, right? But I applied for a job in the local paper, the Manchester Evening News. And I didn't have a job in the, I mean, I wrote about this in a book. I thought, well, I don't have a job in the music industry. If I don't get it, I still don't have a job in the music industry. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I applied for it. I didn't get it. And then 6 months later, the guy that, I got the polite, courteous letter saying, thank you for your recent application, unfortunately, blah, which means basically you've had it, no chance. But they did keep my letter at hand, and he reached out, and I went down and met him and things, and I started selling folk and jazz, which I knew nothing about. I was buying Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd records, you know. And I kind of, in 1978, I got offered, well, I didn't get offered a job in Ireland. A girl that I knew who worked doing displays in record stores. Do you remember record stores? Well, she was doing that, and she lived with a guy who was working for Ireland. He just lost his job because he got a DUI. So she said, "Oh, you should apply for this." And I was very, well, not so much naive, but I was thinking, I don't want to go and promote records and have to laugh at DJs' jokes so that I can get along with them and get them played. Anyway, I went down to meet the guy, and I decided that I wanted it then. And Island Records was my all-time favourite record label because I'd been buying the records in the 60s and I was working with them in the 70s. But what happened was they had financial problems, and regional guys are always the people that go first because they're very protective of their own jobs in London. So we went. I got a job 20 minutes later working for Charisma for £2,000 a year more, which is quite a lot then. And getting an opportunity to work with the Police, who were the biggest band in the world. And that's why I almost jeopardized that by telling the head of promotion, the director of promotion, that I didn't want to move to London. But in saying that, I mean, it grew and grew and grew from then. And a lot of the things I didn't realize in the time but you bleed off a lot of those artists. And like I said to you before, you get to understand the real meaning of success, because at that level there is so much pressure. I mean, I don't want to get on the depressing side of all the artists we lost along the way, whether it's Brian Jones or Janis Joplin or Jimi Hendrix or Kurt Cobain or any of that. But it's an industry that I've built some great relationships, but I've met some of the worst people in the world as well. But as I grew in the industry, I was able to choose who I wanted in my world. More so now. I know when you read my bio at the beginning, it says I, moved to Florida. Well, I lived in Florida for 20 years, but I decided that I'd had enough then, and I relocated to Maryland. So I'm kind of like, I've always had that kind of, you can either call it stupid or courageous, but I've never worried about. I mean, I'm almost writing a book on quotes at the moment, because the things that I'm writing down are things that are explanatory to me, in as much as if you believe it enough, it won't be hard to convince others and stuff like that. And now I'm looking back on things as well, and what I learned from working with David Bowie, who I watched him split the Spiders from Mars in front of me as an 18-year-old, and then 30 years later I'm having my dinner with him and arranging all the press and radio around him. And that doesn't happen to a kid from the north of England. But I become, the gratitude sets in, like I said before. And I think the other thing is the things that I learned from people like Bowie, for instance, and I read an article about this from Mike Garson, who basically played keyboards with him for over 30 years. And after 2 years of his death, he wrote an article. So the great thing about David Bowie was he didn't micromanage, he left you to it. And the interesting thing about that was when I was working with him, every day I used to have to sit down with him before they had the dinner, before going on stage, and go through all the promotion that was available. Well, who doesn't want to write about, talk to, or put David Bowie on TV? It wasn't a hard job. So he's sitting there and I'm reading like what's up. He says, "What's happening, Tony?" I said, "Well, we got this guy at the BBC, David. He's got all your albums. He's a real big fan. He'd like to do something." And the other guy with ITV, which is the commercial station, I said, "Listen, it's entirely up to you. You don't have to do any of them." I said, "But listen, the gig sold out. They're going to show a clip of the video on TV. They're going to talk to you, and then that's it. So he stops and looks at me and says, "Well, what do you think, Tony?" I repeated that. I said, "Well, really, it's up to you, David." I said, "But if I was going to do one, I'd do one. I'd do the guy from the BBC because he's a fan." He looks at me, honestly, Olivia, he says, "If you think I should do it, Tony, I'll do it." I swear to God, I'm not starstruck, but I walked out of that dressing room with my fist clenched and I thought, I don't believe this. David Bowie has agreed to do something on my recommendation. And then, oddly enough, with my own podcast, Moments That Rock, I interviewed a guy called Kevin Armstrong. And my first question was, "David, sorry, Kevin, we're not talking about playing tambourine with a lesser mortal. You played lead guitar with David Bowie at Live Aid. Did that not make you the best guitar player ever?" And he looked straight at me in the screen, Olivia, and he went, "Absolutely, Tony." And that's what I mean about, and the mere fact that he asks you to be his guitar player, it's like being knighted, for God's sake. I mean, you don't have to, but to leave you to it and not say, well, I think you need a little more treble. I think, and people do that. They bring you in and then they kind of stifle you, which stifles creativity. And a lot of the people that grew with Bowie, including myself, learned a lot without being force fed, do this and do that. You were left to do your own. And I'm a great believer in that myself, because I never micromanage with my people. I just, in the same way that I got a job, I went out every single day to prove to that guy that gave me a job in 1974 it was the best decision he ever made. And when I brought people in to manage me, I mean, one of my favorite topics in the music industry was always artist development. And I'm doing that now with Rock the World to Peace. And people like Bowie and Whitney Houston and the Police, they were all successful when I got involved, so I don't take any credit. But I did grow in my trade, working with a band like U2, and we were growing together, which was incredibly beneficial. And I saw a lot of the mistakes that they made, but also the fact that, a lot of those people are chances, that you have to be really courageous in the music business to succeed. And you've got to be, don't forget, you literally wash your dirty laundry in public. You walk out on the stage and you can be booed, you can have bottles thrown at you, anything can happen. But at the same time, it's not a 9 to 5 job. You're working 24/7. It's not a great job to keep a relationship going and things like that. But if you're dedicated and committed to it and give it all you can, maybe it's a little different nowadays, but a lot of those people I saw become successful when I was working with them, I understood why they became successful.
And that being said, a lot of people look at all the different aspects of the music industry and they don't always think of artist development. So with
Never.
what you're doing now, what does artist development even really look like?
Well, arts development is working like with a band that are nobodies, that are just got. I mean, like I say, I could have listened if I'd picked up some of the records that I was offered. I wouldn't be sat here talking to you. I'd be living on some island in the middle of nowhere with a shitload of money and no mates. you know. But I wouldn't put my name to something that I didn't believe that I could. Listen, not everything worked, but if I honestly felt we could do something with it, I did it. But you see, I applied artist development to my staff. I never employed anybody that worked for a record company, in a company that I had like for 25 years independently. I just employed people that had that certain something. And again, one piece of advice: whatever you screw up on, I'll pull you out of. But I empowered them to go out to make it their own. And I had 3 people went on to start their own company. I had one guy that went onto the BBC, and he's still there now doing a national radio program. And my intern went on to manage Coldplay. So artist development, Olivia, does not begin and end with artists. It's about people. And as they grow, I was growing with them, not interrupting with them. Well, like the girl that ended up with the Coldplay gig, she phoned me from a university in Wales and she said, I'm moving to Manchester and I told her I should come and work for you. I said, well, that's very flattering, but there's no room at the inn, meaning we didn't have any vacancies. So she said, well, I'm coming up anyway. Can we have a drink? I said, yeah, we can have a drink. We met and we had a drink. And she said, I'll come and work for you for nothing. I said, really? I said, well, I can't refuse that. I said, but listen, we're responsible for a lot of artists' careers. I can't have you take artists around, but I can put you in a car and you can watch how it works. And you were making cups of tea. But guess what? I make cups of tea as well. So I was not, like I say, I think another asset in a way is delegation, the ability to get other people to do things that are better than you. Well, not necessarily that she made better drinks of tea than me, but you know what I mean? It's kind of like, you empower them, because in the same way that when I went out proving to that guy it was the best job, the best decision he ever made, and I was working 200 miles away from the nerve center of the industry, so I could have ducked and dived and not worked, the hours that I should have done. But I didn't. And I felt that, leaving people alone to do their thing. And I didn't even know that that was what Bowie did later on. I kind of, in a way, subliminally been doing it myself and enjoying it, because I enjoy watching people develop and seeing true potential. And I think a lot of people kind of, I mean, my daughter suffered from it, but having a boss that come in that was just jealous of the fact that she was really good at what she did. So she ended up moving and now she's set up on her own. And she writes about that in her about page, about how she learned things without even having to pay attention. And if you see things done in the right way, I think you bleed off it, you know.
That being said, when you work with artists now and work on the artist development, where do you start with an individual and really make sure you're, as you said, you're focusing on the human, not just the music?
Well, basically, with Rock the World to Peace, I mean, I don't want to go into the sad side of things, but the world is different to the one I grew up in. And we're actually building a foundation for grassroots operations, you know, and places like California that will never repair in the way they have to, and you only have to look at climate change and what's happening in Russia and everywhere. It's tragic. So what we're doing is we're using artists to come in and have a voice. Because when I got approached by a journalist in France, she rang me up and she told me what she was doing. And I was looking at a Bob Dylan poster that I've had for 40 years on the wall. You can't see it now, but it says, "The times they are a changing." Well, Bob Dylan didn't stop the Vietnam War, but he made kids aware. Neil Young were writing songs about the Kent State murders, 4 dead in Ohio. Musicians have always had a voice, and they used to use it. And when the Dixie Chicks called out Bush, that was the end of their career. Because my mentors were the music people, Ahmed Ertig and Chris Blackwell, people who were signing artists who they would have in their record collections. It wasn't run by accountants and lawyers. So I was groomed in the best possible way. My mentors were kind of people that, I just watched how they went about things. And it's not like, I'm not dishing education, but I'm not a great fan of music schools. I mean, it's kind of like I would rather go out and teach myself by just telling them stories than be taught by somebody who's read 4 books on publishing or something like that. Because I think, in a way, if you experience it in the real world, then it's easy to apply it to others. And I love it when people succeed. I never had a problem people leaving me and becoming more successful than me, because a lot of those people, it was their first job in the music industry.
You now currently, as you mentioned earlier, have a podcast, and the podcast really focuses, and it even says in the name, moments that rock. So, what made you decide to start your podcast, and what do you hope people get out of hearing those stories?
Well, I back in the day, and I do a couple of radio shows now as well, but back in the day, I did a show on the largest independent station outside of London, And the only reason I got it was I complained because the guy that was living with me that did a show that played up and coming bands, I mean, bands like New Order and Oasis, they come from Manchester. It's a hub of talent. And then he moved to London to get a job with a national station, and they put a program on at night playing the same stuff they played in the day. So I go up to the program controller's door and I go, bang, 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 bang. It's like, "What's up, Tori?" I'm going, "Well, throwing my arms out. I won't use bad language. And he said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Come in." So I sat down and I said, "Tony," I said, "I live here." His name was Tony as well, right? So I said, "Tony, I live here and I work here. Mark's moved to London and you put another program on playing the same stuff you play all week." And I looked at him like this and I go, "This is a 24-hour a day, 7 day a week, 365-day a year radio station. Can you not find 3 hours a week to play good up and coming music?" And honestly, Olivia looks at me and says, "Well, why don't you do it?" I thought, "Right, I will." And I walked out in another clenched fist moment. And I'm stood in the presenter's room and I'm thinking, "Oh my God, I'd never done a mobile disco, a wedding, or a bar mitzvah in my life. And I'm broadcasting on the biggest station outside of London." And my first 3 programs had Frankie Goes to Hollywood, who were a phenomenon at the time, 1984, New Order, who were from Manchester and they'd never been to the radio station, and U2 was the third one. They all thought it was hilarious. I was on the radio. So I kind of introduced myself with phenomenally successful artists who just thought it was hilarious. And it lasted for 13 years, so I must have done something right. But the thing is, I think it's sometimes when you talk about it, you feel, "I hope I'm not coming on as some kind of I know it all big headed." It's not. It's just like we were talking before. It's having the courage to think, "I can do this. And that goes back to what I said before. If you believe it enough, you can convince others. So when I got on, I mean, it was great because I was getting all these records for free, apart from anything else. But I've always been. There's a million words you can use, like a chancer or something like that. And I found the people that were always around me, the people that I got on with the best, were the people that I kind of admired. I didn't want to be them, but I liked the way they went about things, and Probably confidence is the right word. I've never been like shy or retiring, for want of a better word. It was really interesting actually because I find that when I was going at school, there's a story. My two brands were the first ones was insights from the engine room, lessons learnt from rock and roll. The engine room being where you stoke the fire, the people behind the scenes, and lessons learnt from rock and roll, which I think is a great tagline because it applies to the lessons are applied to everybody. It's not lessons for musicians. It's lessons about opportunities, about resilience, about persistence. Like I said before, mistakes turning into opportunities. Preparing for success is another one. And my case study in that is you two again. They decided to share a publishing deal when they're preparing for the school disco instead of when they were famous, which is what splits bands up when the money comes in. And a couple of them are getting more than the others because they wrote the songs. It's basically get your house in order from day one, think of where you're going to go. Because if you're going to take on something like that, you have to assume you're going to be successful. Otherwise, it's the worst job in the world because you're working 24/7 and you're getting nowhere. But again, like I say, it was the education of a lifetime, and I feel now. I mean, I'm 72 in June. I'm not the oldest man in the world, but I do feel that the Socrates in me is coming out now. It's kind of like I'm thinking things through, and I'm thinking, wow, that was quite a ride. And I sit here and have my own private moments where I'm working ways to do things. And what I was going to say before was I did a podcast with a guy when my second book came out about a couple of years ago, and I have a story in it about meeting Led Zeppelin when I was 15 and going backstage and understanding what it was like to meet your heroes. And I was like, I was 15. I had no idea I was going to work in the music industry 5 years later, where communication skills are needed. And I was doing Latin and stuff like that at school. That was dead handy. So I kind of like the guy's first question. He says, "What do you think the music industry taught you, Tony, that would have helped you as a 15-year-old meeting Led Zeppelin?" I thought, oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, you do get questions like, what's David Bowie like and stuff like that, not the questions that you're asking. I mean, as a person and things. And I said, he asked me what I thought I'd like. I said, well, not as much as you think. He said, really? I said, yeah. I said, when I was 5 or 6 on the school playground, and I realised I didn't want to hang out with this jerk who was a bully. And when I was in my teens and discovering girls, I had to stand in front of them and ask them out and fear rejection and think, oh my God, if she says no, will I ever ask another girl out again? You know? And then, like, when I moved into an industry where communication skills thrived, it was a real asset because I say to this day, you don't learn to drive a car until you're out on the road and you're driving a car with everybody else. And you don't learn interpersonal skills at school. I mean, nowadays, if you want to take something, swipe left and swipe right. I mean, it's like a coward's way out. I mean, I think if somebody's going to say no to you, you've got to turn up again and feel free that somebody will say yes. So I find that those type of things that I learned growing up really helped me in an industry where I was the conduit between the label, the artist, and the manager and the radio station. So if somebody didn't like a record, I was going to tell them that, and that never frightened me, because people like it, in an industry where you should have to take the knocks and the praise at the same time. I mean, and I've had confrontations with people where they're full of their own ego. So I've kind of, given them anxious to feel when I put them up against the wall and saying, "Let me tell you how this works." And you're
Well,
really giving them advice in as much as I've seen people become hugely successful, and
mhm.
you're not looking like that to me.
As a speaker now, what do you try to, I don't want to say push the message out, but like hope people leave with understanding from your talks you give?
Well, it's really easy for me to speak because all I'm doing is talking about myself and what I've learned. I don't have to do any research or anything like this. I never went to Toastmasters. It was more like I wrote a book because other people told me to do it. And then when the time came to take my story out there, I thought, well, and I'm not bragging, but when you tell stories that involve famous people, they kind of listen to them differently because how many people would have met their spouse at a U2 or a David Bowie gig? And the hopeless romantic in me is not just me. There's nothing like music to take you back to a time and a place. And I think that that's really important in the fact that, um, like I said before, the subject matters. I have photographs of U2 having a barbecue in my house, before they played a gig. But that makes them real people. So when you put a slide on with something like that in, with Bono and the Edge hanging over the barbecue, and I'm flipping a burger, and I say things like, well, you've got to remember you two had that hunger at that early age, and they're hanging over an hamburger. But I think the thing is that there was so much that you two were could have failed at any moment in time, and a lot of record labels would have dropped them because they didn't like. I mean, even when they released 4 albums with the same producer and they screwed up at Live Aid, they brought a guy called Brian Eno in to produce the next record, which was The Unforgettable Fire. And Chris Blackwell, who was the founder of Island Records, thought it was a really bad idea. He was trying to persuade him not to do it. And he'd signed Brian Eno to Island Records, but he was making ambient records. There was an album called Music for Airports. He didn't think it was the right match, but he didn't micromanage. He left them to it. And the rest is history, because that album broke them. And the 80s was the Unforgettable Fire into the Joshua Tree. And the rest is history.
Tony, how can people get in touch with you if they want to connect with you?
Well, the best way is my website, really, the info at tonymichaelides.com, and that comes to me. And that's where I get most of my speaking gigs and stuff, because I'm actually more out there at the moment. The worst thing about me is I'm fortunate enough to have my wife that kind of pushes me, and actually the best people in my life are always women. They always kind of nudge me in the nicest possible way. And the girl that I'm working with now, because I'm useless at social media and things like that. And I don't mind if people post things and use the word legend and stuff on their posts, but I'm not kind of, doing it. I mean, I've a mug up there that a girl had in my website put, and it said, and the business card said, legendary publicist to the stars. And I said, who am I going to give that to? I mean, it's like, I give it to people who I know as a joke because I need to get rid of them, but it's kind of like, I've not even been asked if you could do something like that. But I do feel that I'm kind of wising up now, and it's good to go out and share your story and things, because I think we live in an age of storytelling, and I think to have an attentive audience that listen to you, because I find a lot of good reaction. People come up and talk to you and ask you stories, like, because I work with Simon Cowell as well, you see, and I work with. I mean, when I first met Simon Cowell, right, he was 30. He'd been bankrupt twice, and he was living with his parents. you know, you try and say that about the most famous man in the world. It's like, well, he was broke. But he worked at BMG, worked at like 2 labels, Arista and RCA. And he worked on the Arista side. And he worked in a tiny little office. And I was working some of the worst records you've ever heard. I mean, it was kind of like, but I didn't mind standing up to him even then. We'd have meetings in London, and they'd go around and people would say, well, I think we can get it in the Smash Hits, which was a kids magazine. We can get them in there, and we can do kids TV and this and that. And he was playing like a couple of puppets, who'd made a record. And I won't use the F word, but we go around the table, and it looks at me, and I look at myself. What am I supposed to do with that? And I'm doing it in front of the manager, out to the label and things. And I said to him, and I wrote about it in my book, I said, you're not going to get it on the radio. And he said, well, it's going to be a huge hit, And we were both right. It was a huge hit. And it didn't go on the radio. But the fact of the matter, it wasn't a radio record. You can't go in and ask people to play a couple of glove puppets like making a record. It's like, I don't think that's right for us, But the thing with Simon was he was so he was good. He was good at marketing and everything. But the thing is, he had so much belief in himself that he'd stared failure, like he was bankrupt and everything and stuff and things. But he picked himself up and he pushed himself forward and forward and forward. And he got in bed with Simon, well, not literally, with Simon Fuller, who was the Spice Girls manager, who came up with the idea of America's Got Talent, and the rest is history. And even to the extent of Simon didn't want to do it in America, he was told that it would work. And it's funny, really, because being English, I don't know, you're probably too young to remember a program called Fawlty Towers, which was John Cleese. And there's something about Americans that like the English insulting them, because this guy was always like being rude to people and stuff. And the same with Cowell, because when you look at the judges, it was more about the judges than the acts, because he would say, well, it's more like karaoke and stuff and things like that. But anyway, it doesn't matter what I say about him. I mean, he's the boy's done well. But the reason people, again, you talk about achieving success. The reason Simon Cowell is successful is he wouldn't take no for an answer. And as many times as he flopped and failed, and he even got thrown out of Arista because they couldn't afford to give him a tiny little office space. They took him in the other side of the street at RCA, and he put a record out by an act called Robson and Jerome, and BMG were running for a loss that year, and he signed two guys who were actors, right? And he even got a restraining order from them. He was phoning them like day after day after day to make a record. They didn't want to do a record, and then they were on a TV show at 9 o'clock at night on a Sunday, which was peak viewing, and they were good-looking guys as well. So you get the female audience and all that. And they did the Righteous Brothers, You've Lost That Loving Feeling. And he put it out. And that record turned BMG's loss into a profit that year. They were the biggest selling record that they had out of a huge roster that included people like David Bowie and Whitney Houston. So that's what I mean about kind of like the confidence that can be seen as arrogance to some people, but just thinking, I'm going to make this work. And even, I mean, the other thing is another classic example, Olivia, is Richard Branson. A lot of people don't know that Richard Branson has had more failed companies than anybody, right? He's had things like Virgin Litter and Virgin Brides. We know the Virgin Airlines, we know the label, we know the publishing company, we know the stores, but you don't know about the failure. But I remember reading something, he said, I've never worried about a business failing and putting the Virgin name to it, as long as it was worth doing. He didn't mind failure. He just thought that if I put our name to it, I believe in it. And if it fails, and you move on. And of course, he's had enough successful companies. And I like that. I always admire people that are chances, that really stick their neck out and they're not frightened of failing. And I'm that, and I've made some bad choices in my career. I come from an industry, Olivia, where I should know people who walk the walk and talk the talk. And I've been kind of misguided by certain people that tell me something and then it doesn't happen, and I don't understand why they do it. And then I have to kind of dust myself down and move on without any resentment. But it improves you, become more selective about the people you allow into your life. And it's not being precious. It's just thinking, I feel that I'm a great believer in where everybody benefits, and the weird thing is in the stuff that I do, like when I did a radio show, I played records that I liked. Well, I thought if I like them, why wouldn't other people? My podcast is totally self-indulgent. If I enjoy the stories, why wouldn't other people? And I love storytelling in as much as there's a romantic side to it, I mean, I'll give you one example. This started off as a project I had, which I did with Ringling College of Art and Design. These are the kids that go off to work at DreamWorks and Disney and stuff, really talented. And I was living in Florida, I was walking on the beach at 6 a.m. and I stopped and the sun was coming over the Gulf of Mexico, over the Intracoastal Waterway, and there were dolphins playing in the ocean. And I had that senior moment. I gazed out and I thought, I met some amazing people along the way. Who am I to take those stories to the grave? I didn't even have an iPhone at the time. And I picked up my iPhone, bought an iPhone, and the premise being I was going to plonk it in front of people and ask them one question, 3 moments that rocked your world, which were basically 3 pivotal moments that helped shape who they are today. And my classic case study, I mean, I mentioned it to this tech company, Magic Leap, and they wanted to have it as an augmented reality channel, and they were going to fund it and everything. They were the largest funded tech company in history. And then McCann, a friend of mine who worked at McCann, a big marketing company, they loved it. I thought, wow, this is interesting. But here's a classic story, right? Chris Blackwell, the founder of Island Records, his mother went out with Sir Ian Fleming. He lives in Goldeneye, which is a lagoon out in the Bahamas. Could you imagine flying to Goldeneye and asking, he's 87 now, and asking Chris Blackwell to tell you the story about the first time he met Bob Marley in the same place Sir Ian Fleming wrote every James Bond book? You can't make stuff like that up. So that's what I mean about, and it's not like, I don't mean to sound like, the doubly hopeless romantic, but I would love to hear stuff like that. And that's what I mean about, I think that I think we all have stories to tell. If you can find your audience and attentive people to listen, the likes of ourselves and things, by not trying to make an impression on them, but just sharing what you found that worked for you. And I don't think you can do that when you're kind of 21 or something. You have to wait along. And I look back at a lot of my moments now, and I try and shape what I'm doing now in a different time and a different place into some of the things that creep into my fading memory.
Well, thank you, Tony, for all of your insight today.
Is that
And
it already? My word.
yeah, you're just sharing your stories, and time flies when that happens. And
Well, I hope I didn't go off on a tangent.
no, it was amazing and so informative and makes all of us think. Like you had so many stories that make us think, and I even have a few of those key takeaways from today's conversation, which include success can happen even in moments of mistakes, like you
Yeah.
said, you two, and going off, potentially a scheduled path of moments. And there can be such growth in those moments and unexpected success as well as don't micromanage. When you tend to micromanage, then not only, yes, are you the one making all the decisions, but as Tony mentioned, you hurt someone else's growth. You can hurt the growth of the team and just ideas that come out, implementation that will happen, as well as artist development doesn't just start or end with the music. It really focuses on the people. As well as you have a voice, how will you use it? And that's a challenge I want to give everyone listening today is whether it's through music, through podcasting, through being in your office, we all have a voice. And how are you going to use that voice to make a difference? As well as have the courage to think, I have courage to do this. And lastly, what are your 3 moments that rocked your world? What are those 3 moments that changed things that really are pivotal moments in your life? This was a great episode with our top-notch guest, Tony Michaelides. Thank you for listening and have a successful day.